all know a guy who only occasionally shaves for big occasions, and it's because that occasional shave really hurts. It's the time of year for big occasions, and yet there he is, suffering with that cheap drugstore razor. Let's help him out. Henson Shaving's line of razors, built with aerospace precision, deliver a smooth shave your dad, brother, and even son can enjoy, eventually. With replacement blades just 10 cents each, you'll buy it once and they'll use it for life. How's that for the perfect gift? Celebrate with 100 free blades on your first purchase, and no subscription headaches. HensonShaving.com/holiday.
Warning. The following podcast might be too truthful for most liberals. Listener discretion is therefore advised.
Welcome to the Tea Party Power Hour, and what a show do we have lined up for you today? We have Mr. Michael Barone on the show. I'm sure all of you have been familiar with him for quite some time. You'll know him as a senior political analyst for the Washington Examiner. He is a historian, a pundit, a journalist, a frequent commentator on Fox News, a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He's also the principal co-author of the Almanac of American Politics, which has been published every other year for over 5 decades. His new book, Mental Maps of the Founders, How Geographic Imaginations Guided America's Revolutionary Leaders, goes on sale today. You could actually go to Amazon right now and get a copy of this. Mr. Barone, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's very good to be with you.
Interesting title. I was immediately intrigued by the title of this book, Mental Maps of the Founders, How Geographic Imagination Guided the American Revolutionary Leaders. What exactly do you mean by mental maps?
Well, I think we all have mental maps in our heads with some degree of completeness and specificity, and others with very little. People who have poor senses of direction tend to be hooked on these days on their GPS. But we have an idea of how to get to the nearest shopping mall or where to get to the ATM. And we do that. I'm a person who has always been has a pretty good sense of direction, and have always had a mental map in my head. I grew up in Northwest Detroit in an area that's laid out in square miles with rectangular streets. You know which way north, south, and east and west are. You know how long a mile is. That sort of layout, by the way, was suggested initially and prompted for the what was then called the Northwest area, west of Pennsylvania, north of the Ohio River, by Thomas Jefferson in the 1780s in the Continental Congress. And we have these maps, and I was thinking about, I've read the Founding Fathers, and I have read many of the wonderful books, biographies, analyses, comparatives that have been written by academic historians, by non-academic historians, even the Broadway musical of Alexander Hamilton, adapted from the wonderful biography by Ron Chernow. And I thought, what were the mental maps the Founding Fathers had? Nobody had really written a book along those lines or comparison, because they were dealing with a North America whose geography they had only a limited knowledge of. If you look at the maps that were drawn in the 1740s and 50s, they're pretty good about the coastal areas of North America. They have an idea that there are sort of parallel ridges of the Appalachian chains, although they haven't got them very well located. And beyond that, it's kind of terra incognito. They know there are big lakes out in the Northwest somewhere, and that there's a Mississippi River and things, but they've got it all wrong. And when they're in the process of conducting the American Revolution, trying to set up the new country, the founders had different ideas about what would be the extent of the new country, what would be the boundaries, what were the desirable expansions, if any, And so I wanted to learn more about this. And my friend Luke Cannon, the Reagan biographer, great political reporter, once told me, he says, if you want to really learn about a subject, write a book about it. So my result is Mental Maps of the Founding Fathers, 6 essays about 6 of the founders and their geographic orientation, their vision of the country, each one of which was different.
I think you're very right as far as learning by writing a book. Now, I have not authored a book, but when I think back to my college career, what I remember most were the research projects I did. Not the memorize something out of a book and regurgitate it for a test, but the research projects where I was in the library doing the research myself. So I can only imagine that you learned a great deal about the mental maps of our founding fathers. Now, you started out with Ben Franklin. Now, talk to me about Ben Franklin's mental maps that you were able to discover in your research.
Well, I think Benjamin Franklin's biggest contribution was to think of the seaboard colonies as a unit. Remember, they had been founded by very different people in different circumstances. The Calvinist Puritans of New England, the Anglican believers of Virginia, the Catholic proprietors of the colony of Maryland, and the Quaker proprietors of Pennsylvania. They all, each of them had its own ties with London and with some of the British colonies in the West Indies. They didn't have much ties with each other. They didn't think of themselves necessarily as a unit. They had a lot of diversity, to use a word that we hear a lot about today. But in fact, the areas that become the United States always had a lot of cultural diversity. Franklin is thinking of them as a unit. He's thinking of them that way because he's a businessman and a printer, which also meant a publisher. In 1732, at the age of 26, he starts publishing Poor Richard's Almanac with a view towards circulating this annual publication, more sales every year, up and down the seaboard coast and even to some of the West Indian British possessions. He's thinking about this. He is sponsoring, he's the impresario of the evangelical preacher George Whitefield, who captivated audiences in the colonies up and down from the Carolinas up to Massachusetts. And even though he's not a strong religious believer himself, he becomes a great friend of Whitefield's as well as a business partner. He learns about the different colonies. And when there's a war with the French threatened in the 1750s, the French are in control of the St. Lawrence Valley. They have fur traders going to the Great Lakes and up and down the Mississippi River, thinly populated with French, but they're threatening the British colonies. Franklin prepares for an Albany conference with the Iroquois to defend against the French. He publishes a political cartoon of a snake cut into a dozen different pieces, and they're labeled with the abbreviations for each of the colonies. And the legend underneath it is "Join or Die." He's got an idea of a North American polity that eventually becomes a republic. He promotes initially an idea that looks something like the Dominion status that Britain, a century later, grants to Canada, to Australia, to New Zealand, but that sort of ties with Britain. He predicts accurately that the 13 seaboard colonies will have more people in a century than England. Turns out to be exactly correct. So Franklin contributes the idea of a unit there, which wasn't a lively idea before he comes along.
One of the things that I read about you preparing for this interview is that you're a lover of maps. Should I take that to mean that you're also a collector of maps?
Well, I'm not a collector in the sense that I have, very valuable antique maps. I've got a few of them. I've got on my walls, I have a London in 1763 and a Tokyo from the late 19th century and a few other, an overview of Boston in the 1890s. But I like to have maps. I like to have orientation. I've got a big collection of road maps, which basically is a little obsolete right now. It's taking up a lot of file drawers, and the road maps themselves tend to be, at least 10 years old, so they don't show the new freeways. And I've got the functional equivalent on my iPad, but maybe there's an historical archive somewhere I can deed my road maps to.
My father was a lover of maps. He was also a big fan of Texas history, and one of the gifts I gave him one Christmas was a map of the original Texas, the Republic of Texas, which he cherished very much. So I can relate to you through my father as far as the love of maps. Now, again, the book is called Mental Maps of the Founders, and if ever there was a guy who had a mental set of maps in his head, it was George Washington, because of all the surveying work he had done for the Fairfax family and his skirmishes that he had been involved in different territories. Talk to us about how this geographic knowledge in George Washington's head led to him being chosen for certain assignments and probably played a role in his ascension up the military ladder.
Well, my chapter on George Washington is subtitled North by Northwest. George Washington was not always a rich and prominent person. He was the son of a second marriage. His father died when he was 11 years old. His mother basically kicked him off the property that he inherited from his father. He was looking to make his way forward, and he got hired at age 16 by Lord Fairfax. Lord Fairfax was the proprietor of a dominion that extended all of northern Virginia and what now is West Virginia between the Rappahannock and Potomac rivers. I described that with more particularity. And he came over from England because he thought his local agents were robbing him blind. He hires the 16-year-old George Washington to go west of the Blue Ridge Mountains to Indian country to survey. And surveying was, a technical requirement. You had to go through this heavily forested land of North America, which you or I, if we had been walking through it as it existed then, probably couldn't have made head or tail of. But Washington has his instruments. They tend to do surveying work in the fall and winter when there were fewer leaves obstructing the views. And he becomes acquainted with Indians there. He ends up buying his first tranche of property in the Shenandoah Valley at age 18 off using some of the money he'd earned from Lord Fairfax. And when it comes time for the Virginia House of Burgesses to try to get somebody to warn the French, to keep the French from encroaching on the Virginia colony. The French are threatening to create a fort at the forks of the Ohio River, where Allegheny, Monongahela rivers come together to form the Ohio River. It's the site of downtown Pittsburgh today, familiar to many Americans, perhaps if they're baseball fans or whatever. But George Washington is sent up there because he knows the Western country. He's spent some time there. And he gets involved with leading a militia force there in subsequent years as a young man in his early 20s, and sparking what becomes a kind of world war between France and Britain. He's not very militarily successful, but he does gain military experience. And so when it comes time, 2 decades later in the 1770s, when the Continental Congress is assembled for the second time in 1775 to appoint a military leader to command the Continental Army that's active up in Massachusetts against the British. He's standing there in the group. He's been elected by the House of by Virginians to represent as one of the representatives of the state. He is in his military uniform, the Fairfax County Militia, and he's nominated by John Adams of Massachusetts to lead a force of mostly Yankees, and like Benjamin Franklin, he comes to appreciate very quickly the differences between the different colonies, even while he's trying to unite them militarily into one unit. He finds that the leadership qualities that work with leading troops from Virginia don't work very well with New Englanders. You have to approach them in a different way. They've got different attitudes. And he comes to explore that land in his multiple years as Revolutionary War commander, keeping the army intact, winning occasional victories against the British and wearing them down, and concentrating on recapturing New York, which he's thrown out of in 1776. New York is the key geographical link between the New England colonies, which are against the British, and Virginia and the Philadelphia Chesapeake Bay area that is against the British. New York is less certain, and he's always concentrating on getting New York. And he's also concentrating in his land speculations on that north by northwest. He wants to build a canal paralleling the Potomac River and then going through the mountains to the forks of the Ohio. He is investing in land and property in the Ohio River country and amassing a great empire of land. And he foresees an America, I think, that may be the industrial heartland of 100 years later. One of the comments he makes as he's riding out to north by northwest towards the forks, the Ohio country, is, oh, they've got some interesting, very good quality of coal here. Coal, the absolutely necessary ingredient of the Industrial Revolution and of the industries that enabled the North to win the Civil War and that enabled America in the 20th century to become the arsenal of democracy. Washington is leading us in that direction. He doesn't much care for the South. He doesn't care very much, doesn't like areas where big majorities of the population are slaves. He ends up freeing his own slaves in his will, in what was obviously an attempt to set an example for the whole country, as he had set an example as a commander who gives up his command and as a president who voluntarily retires.
Speaking of slavery, I find it interesting that a lot of the woke crowd wants to tear down statues of George Washington because they felt he was a racist because he owned slaves. But when you compare him to other men of his day, he was actually taking steps that would eventually result in the abolition of slavery, was he not?
Yes, he was. And one of the interesting things about going through the colonies with different is the change in attitudes in the lifetimes of many of these people. Benjamin Franklin, who was originally from Massachusetts, leaves as a teenager, settles in Philadelphia. He owned a couple slaves in Philadelphia at one point as a young man. George Washington owned more than 100 slaves. Thomas Jefferson, in part through his marriage, at least 200. James Madison's family had multiple slaves, and in fact, his grandfather had been murdered by a slave, or at least the slave was convicted of his murder. They take slavery for granted in the 1740s and 50s. It's just part of life. This is something that happens. The revolution changes their minds. The idea they're talking about liberty, that Jefferson is writing that all men are created equal. It's occurring to them that the continued existence of slavery is kind of inconsistent with what they're risking their lives and their sacred honor for. And what you see is that you have gradual abolition of the 1780s. You have gradual abolition of slavery voted by the legislatures of Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Pennsylvania. You have the courts of Massachusetts and New Hampshire declaring that slavery does not exist. You have the then independent Republic of Vermont creating a constitution that bans slavery forever. These abolitions of slavery were gradual. They were not complete. They were not what we would vote for today, you and me and virtually every other American. But they were moves in that direction which they had not anticipated before. Jefferson, in his notes on Virginia, writes 3 separate passages about slavery and slaves. He's clearly uneasy about the subject and is caught up in the contradictions, even though he accumulates so many debts that he frees almost none of his slaves. Washington, as I said, really sets an example. He sits down and writes personally his own will. He researches the law of the state of Virginia and so forth, and how it allows him to free his slaves. He sets up pools of money that can support his slaves after their liberation, one of which lives 32 years after his death, and is supported by the money that Washington set aside. So he's telling us something that's important, and shows that this simple-minded attempt to say, well, these people were just slaveholders and we're so much more wonderful people than they are. Put us in their place. Would we have had the courage to do what George Washington did? What Madison's chief aide, Edward Coles, did, where he took his slaves to Illinois, liberated them, bought land, lost all his friends, left behind all his relatives. How many of us would have the courage to do that and the initiative? And I think the answer is many fewer than those who stand up there and from a position of luxury on this issue say, well, we know what they should have done. They're real rascals for not doing what obviously they should have done. It was a little more difficult than that.
One of the things I want to ask you is whether or not there is anything about the book that you were hoping I would ask you about, or that you want to make sure that the listener knows that we haven't covered. I always know that a lot of times after an interview, a subject of the interview will say, oh, I wish we could have talked about this, or I wish you would have asked me about that. Is there anything that you would like to get out there that I haven't asked you about?
Well, one of the things I've been thinking about is the contrasting views that often resulted in major political differences. I mean, here you have George Washington, who writes kind of clunky prose, who is known for sitting kind of quietly and listening to others talk about issues and maintaining a silence, close attention, but silence. And who does he hire for his cabinet when he becomes the first president? Well, he hires 2 people, Alexander Hamilton as Treasury Secretary, the youngest Treasury Secretary in history, still is the youngest that ever held that office. He was 34 years old. Thomas Jefferson, the brilliant writer and aesthete, wonderful golden prose. So we hold these truths to be self-evident and so forth. All men are created equal. It's hard to be totally for slavery when you set those words down on paper. And they see things differently. Hamilton, as he writes in one of the Federalist papers, he talks about having New England on the left and the Carolinas on the right. He's looking out to sea. Hamilton's mental maps were a series of voyages, of lines of commerce across the ocean between trading cities where you had bankers, where you had people that were loaning money, capitalists loaning money, insurers insuring voyages. He had gotten his start in the West Indies and in St. Croix, in a society that was 90% slaves selling sugar. His father deserted him. His mother died. He was put in charge of a merchant's office at age 17 and started ordering the ship captains around and collecting on debts that the owners could never have collected on. He's doing all that. He gets locals to pay for him for a trip to New York. He never goes back to the Caribbean. He does not he's always against slavery. But he wants a republic that is connected with commerce to the rest of the world, that has a navy to protect that commerce and to protect its shores from invasion. And he has a whole set of financial policies that he starts concocting when he's a 20-something aide to George Washington in the field in the Revolutionary War. So his looking outward to the Atlantic. Jefferson is always looking inward. His one book is called Notes on Virginia. It looks to the west. Jefferson himself never went much farther west than the Blue Ridge. In fact, his father was the author of a map in 1751 that George Washington used, the Joshua Fry Peter Jefferson map. He went farther west than his son Thomas ever went. But Jefferson, purchased Louisiana, dispatched the Lewis and Clark Peak, and the Notes on Virginia goes well beyond the Virginia limits as they were then or as they are now. He talks about the Missouri River. He tells you how many miles it is from St. Louis to Mexico City. He's looking across North America. The one thing that's missing is New England. He doesn't talk about the Atlantic coast much. He doesn't talk about the Atlantic trade. He's New England, the area that was big on merchant shipping and trading with the West Indies and with Europe, doesn't appear in his book at all, doesn't appear on his map or his father's map. He's looking westward. So you have those two different mental maps, and they have very different policies. These become the basis of two-party politics in the 1790s. It becomes the basis of their disagreement. Hamilton wants to have an alliance with, there's a world war between revolutionary France and mercantile Britain. Hamilton wants an alliance with Britain or peace with Britain because it's our major trading party. He's looking across the Atlantic. Jefferson wants an alliance with France. He's sympathetic with the revolution in France, and he's looking westward across the continent. So the mental maps that they carried with them had tremendous consequences.
The name of the book is Mental Maps of the Founders, How Geographic Imagination Guided America's Revolutionary Leaders by Michael Barone. I assume it's available wherever good books are sold?
Here. Yes, absolutely.
Well, it's been an absolute honor having you on the show today. I hope you sell many, many copies of the book. And as soon as we get this interview all packaged up and sent out, we're going to try to help you do that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's been a delight to be with you, and I thank you for all your time and for your good questions.
You're more than welcome, sir. Don't be a stranger. Come back and see us.
Okay, okie doke.
All right, thank you, sir. Have a good day.
You've been listening to the Tea Party Power Hour with Mark Gillar.
We all know a guy who only occasionally shaves for big occasions, and it's because that occasional shave really hurts. It's the time of year for big occasions, and yet there he is, suffering with that cheap drugstore razor. Let's help him out. Henson Shaving's line of razors, built with aerospace precision, deliver a smooth shave your dad, brother, and even son can enjoy, eventually. With replacement blades just 10 cents each, you'll buy it once and they'll use it for life. How's that for the perfect gift? Celebrate with 100 free blades on your first purchase, and no subscription headaches. HensonShaving.com/holiday.
Feel the whoa with Listerine at BJ's. You can save $2.50 now on Listerine products like Total Care Anti-Cavity Fluoride Fresh Mint Mouthwash or Cool Mint Pocket Packs Fresh Breath Strips at your nearest BJ's location. Experience the feeling of a million germs zapped in seconds with Listerine. Discount available through December 24th. Save now only at BJ's.